The roar of the rapids swallowed Beatrice Turner's screams as the muddy water dragged her toward the falls, her sodden skirts wrapping around her legs like iron chains. She clawed at the surface, gasping, choking, her vision blurring as the current spun her like a leaf in a windstorm. The June sun blazed overhead, indifferent to her struggle, and through the spray she glimpsed the rocky precipice ahead, where the Gila River plunged 30 feet into churning foam below. Marshal Kane had been riding fence line for the Sullivan Ranch when he spotted the blue fabric tumbling through the water. His chestnut gelding was already moving before his brain fully registered what he was seeing. Hooves thundering down the embankment as he spurred the animal into a dead run parallel to the river. The falls were maybe 200 yards ahead, close enough that he could hear their constant thunder even over the pounding of his horse's hooves and his own hammering heartbeat. He had seconds, maybe less. "Hold on," he shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the water's fury. He guided his horse closer to the bank, eyes calculating distance and speed and the deadly mathematics of rescue. The river was swollen from mountain snowmelt, faster and more vicious than he had ever seen it, and the woman was already weakening, her movements growing sluggish. Marshal kicked his horse into the shallows where the current ran slightly slower, feeling the powerful tug immediately as water swirled around the animal's legs. His gelding snorted but trusted him, pushing deeper until the water reached Marshal's stirrups. He unwound his lariat with practiced speed, fingers working the rope even as he steered with his knees. The woman was maybe 40 feet away now, being swept closer to the falls with every passing second. He swung the loop once, twice, building momentum, then sent it flying. The rope fell short, snatched away by the current. Marshal cursed and hauled it back in, his muscles burning as he fought the water's resistance. 30 feet to the falls. The woman's head went under and came back up, her arms flailing weakly. 25 feet. The second throw was true. The loop settled over her shoulders and Marshal yanked it tight, feeling the sudden jarring weight as the rope went taut. His horse planted its hooves and pulled back, nearly sitting on its haunches with the effort. Marshal wrapped the rope around his saddle horn and added his own strength, hauling hand over hand as his gelding backed steadily away from the deadly current. The woman came toward them in lurching increments, coughing and sputtering, sometimes disappearing beneath the surface only to reappear a moment later. 15 feet from the falls. 10 feet. Marshal's shoulders screamed in protest, but he kept pulling, the rope burning his palms through his leather gloves. His horse backed onto the bank, and suddenly the angle changed, the current losing its grip as the woman reached shallower water. 5 feet from the precipice, Marshal slid from his saddle and waded in, fighting the current that tried to knock him off his feet. He grabbed the rope with both hands and pulled with everything he had, dragging her toward safety even as the water tried to claim them both. His boots found purchase on river stones, and he hauled her up onto the muddy bank, just as a massive branch swept past where she had been moments before and launched itself over the falls. She collapsed on the grass, retching up river water, her entire body shaking with cold despite the summer heat. Her dark hair hung in sodden ropes around her face and her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing an ugly scrape where rocks had caught her. Marshal dropped to his knees beside her, his own chest heaving from exertion. "You are safe now," he said, his voice rough. "Just breathe. You are safe." Her eyes opened, the deepest brown he had ever seen, and fixed on his face with an intensity that caught him off guard. She tried to speak, but dissolved into another coughing fit, more water streaming from her mouth. Marshal supported her shoulders, helping her sit up as she cleared her lungs. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "Thank you," she finally managed, the words barely more than a whisper. "I thought I was dead. You nearly were." Marshal glanced back at the falls, their spray creating rainbows in the afternoon sun. "What happened?" "How did you end up in there, my horse?" she gasped. "She spooked at a rattlesnake, threw me right into the current before I knew what was happening. I could not get my feet under me, could not find anything to grab onto." Marshal helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed dangerously. He kept one hand on her elbow to steady her. "Can you ride? My ranch is not far. You need dry clothes and something hot to drink, or you will catch your death despite the weather." She nodded, though her face had gone pale beneath the tan. Marshal retrieved his horse, which had wandered a few feet away to crop grass as if nearly dying was just another day's work. He mounted first, then reached down and pulled her up behind him with surprising ease despite her waterlogged clothing. She wrapped her arms around his waist, and he tried not to notice how her body pressed against his back, cold and trembling. "I am Beatrice Turner," she said as they started moving. "My father owns the freight business in Pinos Altos, Marshal Kane. I work the Sullivan Ranch, but I own a small spread about a mile from here. Your parents were optimistic, naming you Marshal." He felt rather than saw her attempt at a smile. "My mother had ambitions. I disappointed her by preferring cattle to criminals." They rode in silence for a while, following a well-worn track that climbed away from the river. The landscape around Pinos Altos was a study in contrasts, pine-covered mountains rising to the north while scrubby desert stretched south toward Silver City. Marshall's ranch sat in the sweet spot between, where grass grew thick enough to support his growing herd and water ran year-round from mountain springs. His cabin came into view, a sturdy log structure with a covered porch and a good stone chimney. The barn behind it was newer, built just last year when he had finally saved enough to expand his operation. A few horses grazed in the corral and chickens scratched in the yard. It was not much, but it was his. Marshal dismounted and helped Beatrice down, noting how her knees buckled when her feet touched ground. He caught her before she could fall, lifting her easily in his arms. "Easy now. You have been through hell today." "I can walk," she protested, but without much conviction. "I am sure you can." "But you do not have to." He carried her up the porch steps and into the cabin, setting her gently on the chair nearest the cold fireplace. "I will get a fire going and find you something dry to wear. Not exactly fashionable, but better than catching pneumonia." Beatrice looked around the cabin while he worked, taking in the neat interior with its handmade furniture and sparse decorations. Everything was clean and orderly, if simple. A bookshelf in one corner held maybe 24 volumes, their spines worn from use. The sight surprised her. Most cowboys she knew could barely write their own names. "You read," she said. "When I have time. Winter nights get long up here." Marshal struck a match and coaxed flame from the kindling he kept prepared. Soon a cheerful blaze was crackling in the hearth. He disappeared into what must be his bedroom and returned with a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "These will swim on you, but they are warm. I will step outside while you change." "Wait." Beatrice stood on shaky legs. "I do not think I can manage the buttons. My hands are shaking too badly." Marshal hesitated, then nodded. He helped her with the tiny buttons running down the back of her dress, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. The fabric peeled away from her skin with a squelching sound, and she shivered despite the growing warmth from the fire. He kept his eyes averted as she stepped out of the ruined dress, then turned his back while she struggled into his dry clothes. "You can look now," she said finally. He turned to find her drowning in his shirt, the hem reaching nearly to her knees over the rolled-up trousers. Her hair still dripped onto the floor, but color was returning to her cheeks. Something in his chest tightened at the sight of her standing in his cabin wearing his clothes, vulnerable and brave all at once. "I will make coffee," he said gruffly, moving to the stove, "and see about some food." "When did you last eat?" "This morning. I was surveying the road north of town for my father, checking for washouts after the spring floods. I never expected the horse to throw me like that." She sank back into the chair, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. "I thought I was a better rider. Even the best riders get surprised sometimes. That rattler probably struck without warning." Marshal set the coffee pot on the stove and added wood to the firebox. "You said your father runs freight. That would be Turner Express." "Yes, you know it." "Everyone in Grant County knows Turner Express. Your father has built quite an operation." He rummaged in his pantry and emerged with bacon, eggs, and a loaf of bread. "I heard he was expanding the routes, maybe going as far as Tucson." "He is. That is why I was checking the roads. He wants me to take over the business eventually, says I need to know every mile of every route." Beatrice watched him cook with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice. Most men would not teach their daughters such things. Most men are fools. Marshal cracked eggs into the skillet where bacon was already sizzling. "My mother ran our family ranch for 10 years after my father died. Did a better job of it than he ever did, if I am honest. I learned everything I know from her." "Is she still ranching?" "She passed 3 years ago. Left me the land and the knowledge to work it." He plated the food and brought it to the small table, gesturing for her to join him. "Eat. You need your strength." Beatrice discovered she was ravenous. The food disappeared quickly, and Marshal refilled her plate without comment. The coffee was strong and hot, burning away the last of the chill that had settled into her bones. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and the soft sounds of their meal the only noise in the cabin. "I should get word to my father," Beatrice said eventually. "He will be worried when I do not return. Town is 7 miles from here. I will ride in at first light and let him know you are safe. You should rest tonight. Make sure you have recovered fully before traveling." She wanted to protest, but exhaustion was already pulling at her. The trauma of nearly drowning, combined with the warmth and food, had left her feeling boneless and heavy. "I could not impose like that." "You are not imposing. I have a spare room such as it is. You will be perfectly safe and perfectly respectable. Though I imagine tongues will wag regardless once word gets out." Marshal stood and began clearing the plates. "But I would rather face gossip than have you collapse on the ride to town." Beatrice knew he was right, though the thought of the scandal made her wince. Pino's Altos was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and a young, unmarried woman spending the night at a bachelor's ranch would fuel speculation for months. Still, the alternative was risking the ride when she could barely keep her eyes open. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything. You saved my life today." Marshal paused in his washing up, looking at her over his shoulder. "I did what anyone would do. But you were the one who did it. That matters." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection forged in crisis, but already growing into something deeper. Marshal felt it in the way his pulse quickened when their eyes met. Beatrice felt it in the warm flutter low in her belly that had nothing to do with the coffee. They were strangers still, but the foundations of something profound had been laid in those desperate moments beside the falls. Marshal showed her to the spare room, which held little more than a narrow bed and a washstand, but was clean and comfortable. He brought her a quilt his mother had made, the stitching still perfect despite its age, and bid her good night. Beatrice crawled under the covers, still wearing his oversized clothes, and fell asleep almost instantly, her dreams full of rushing water and strong hands pulling her to safety. In his own room, Marshal lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events. He had lived in these mountains for 30 years, the last 5 on his own ranch, and thought he knew every possible danger they held. Yet nothing had prepared him for the terror of seeing Beatrice swept toward those falls, or the fierce protectiveness that had seized him when he pulled her from the water. She was educated, cultured, the daughter of one of the richest men in Grant County. He was a rancher with dirt under his nails and calluses on his hands. By all logic, their paths should never have crossed, let alone intertwined. But logic seemed a poor match for the memory of her arms around his waist as they rode, or the way she had looked at him with those bottomless brown eyes. Morning came with golden light streaming through the windows and the smell of bacon frying. Beatrice woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar room before the previous day's events came flooding back. She sat up, noting that her muscles ached and her throat felt raw, but otherwise she seemed remarkably intact. The sound of Marshal moving around the main room drew her from bed. She found him at the stove again, cooking breakfast with the same competent efficiency as the night before. He had shaved and put on a clean shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing. He looked younger in the morning light, perhaps only 25 or 26, though the lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting against sun and wind. "Morning," he said, glancing up with a slight smile. "How are you feeling? Sore, grateful, embarrassed?" Beatrice gestured at his clothes, which she still wore, and apparently a thief of men's clothing. "Keep them. They look better on you anyway." The words were out before Marshal could stop them, and he felt heat rise in his face. "I mean, until we can retrieve your things. Your dress is hanging by the fire. Still damp, but it should be dry by afternoon." They ate breakfast on the porch, watching the sun climb over the mountains and burn off the morning mist. The view was spectacular, stretching for miles across rolling grassland dotted with juniper and pine. In the distance, the Gila River was a silver thread winding through the landscape, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "I should go into town," Marshal said reluctantly. "Let your father know what happened. He will want to come fetch you himself, I imagine, probably with a shotgun." Beatrice tried for humor, but her voice was tight. "He is protective, and this situation looks rather compromising. I will explain everything. Any reasonable man would understand." Marshal stood and stretched, his joints popping. "Though if he wants to shoot me, I suppose I cannot blame him. His daughter did spend the night under my roof. If he tries to shoot you, I will explain exactly how improper you were, which is to say, not at all." Beatrice met his eyes. "You have been nothing but a gentleman, Marshal Kane. I will make sure everyone knows it." He tipped his hat to her and headed for the barn to saddle his horse. Beatrice watched him go, admiring the easy way he moved and the confident set of his shoulders. She had grown up around rough men, freight drivers and miners and cowboys, but there was something different about Marshal. A quiet strength that did not need to announce itself. A gentleness that did not diminish his masculinity. The ride into Pino's Altos took Marshal an hour at an easy pace. The town had grown since silver was discovered in the mountains back in the 1860s, though it had never reached the wild prosperity of Silver City to the south. Still, it was a respectable community with a church, a school, several saloons, and the Turner Express office that dominated the main street. Bernard Turner was a bull of a man, barrel-chested and loud, with iron-gray hair and a beard to match. He was standing outside his office directing the loading of a freight wagon when Marshal rode up. His face went from curious to furious in the span of a heartbeat when Marshal explained what had happened. "My daughter spent the night where?" he bellowed, loud enough to turn heads up and down the street. "At my ranch, sir. She nearly drowned yesterday and was in no condition to travel. I assure you, she was perfectly safe and I behaved with complete propriety. Marshal kept his voice level despite the older man's volume. She is welcome to stay as long as she needs to recover, but I thought you should know what happened. Bernard's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. You thought I should know. You thought you should keep my daughter overnight at your bachelor cabin and then ride in here like it was nothing. I saved her life, Mr. Turner. The alternative was letting her ride 7 miles in a state of shock and exhaustion, possibly catching pneumonia or worse. I made the choice I thought was right. The choice you thought was right, Bernard repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And I suppose you think that makes everything proper and decent. A small crowd was gathering, drawn by Bernard's shouting. Marshal could see the speculation in their eyes, the way gossip was already forming and spreading like wildfire. He kept his attention on Bernard, refusing to be cowed despite the older man's size and fury. I think I did what any decent man would do in that situation. If you want to fault me for that, go ahead. But your daughter is safe and alive, which is more than she would have been if I had not been riding fence line yesterday. Bernard opened his mouth to respond, but a new voice cut through the tension. Father, stop making a scene. Beatrice had arrived on horseback, still wearing Marshal's oversized clothes with her torn dress bundled in front of her. She slid from the saddle and walked to stand beside Marshal, her chin lifted defiantly. Marshal saved my life and then treated me with nothing but respect. If you want to be angry at someone, be angry at that rattlesnake that spooked my horse. Beatrice, you cannot understand how this looks, Bernard began, his voice lowering slightly. I understand perfectly well. I also understand that I would be dead if not for him. I was going over those falls, Father. I had maybe 30 seconds left when he rode in and pulled me out. Her voice shook slightly, but she kept going. So if you want to protect my reputation, fine, but you will not do it by attacking the man who saved me. The crowd had grown larger, people stopping their morning business to watch the drama unfold. Marshal could see the Turner Express employees hanging out the office windows, and several of the saloon girls had emerged to observe from across the street. In a town like Pinos Altos, this would be the talk of the week. Bernard looked between his daughter and Marshal, his anger warring with obvious relief and a growing sense of awkwardness. Finally, he let out a long breath and extended his hand to Marshal. You are right, both of you. I apologize for my reaction. Thank you for saving my daughter's life. Marshal shook his hand, relieved that the situation had not escalated further. No apology necessary, sir. I understand your concern. Still, the situation is complicated now. Bernard glanced at the watching crowd and lowered his voice. People are going to talk. They already are. By noon, half the county will think you compromised her. Let them think what they want, Beatrice said firmly. I know the truth. That is what matters. But Marshal could see the worry in Bernard's eyes and understood the older man's concern. In 1878, a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily damaged and difficult to repair. Even though nothing improper had happened, the mere appearance of impropriety could be enough to ruin Beatrice's standing in the community. That could affect her ability to take over her father's business, could limit her future prospects in ways both personal and professional. There is a solution, Marshal heard himself say, if Miss Turner would be willing. They both turned to look at him. He took a breath, hardly believing what he was about to propose but knowing it was the right thing to do. We could marry, quickly, quietly. It would silence the gossip and protect your daughter's reputation. Beatrice stared at him, her mouth falling open. Bernard looked equally shocked. The watching crowd leaned in, trying to hear what was being said. You would marry her to protect her reputation, Bernard asked slowly. You barely know each other. I know she is brave and intelligent. I know she cares about her father's business and wants to make her own way in the world. I know she did not panic when she was drowning, just kept fighting. Marshal looked at Beatrice, his gray eyes steady. I know those are the qualities I would want in a wife. The rest we can figure out as we go. That is insane, Beatrice whispered. You cannot throw your whole life away because of gossip. I am not throwing anything away. I am making an offer. You can refuse it if you want, but the offer stands. Marshal meant every word. The idea of marrying this woman he had just met should have terrified him, but instead it felt right in a way he could not explain. Like pulling her from the river, it was simply what needed to be done. Bernard was watching his daughter's face, reading emotions there that Marshal could only guess at. Finally, the older man spoke. Beatrice, this is your choice. Whatever you decide, I will support you, but decide quickly. The longer we stand here arguing, the worse the talk will get. Beatrice looked at Marshal for a long moment, searching his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. All right, if you are sure about this, then yes, I will marry you. The words were barely out of her mouth before the crowd erupted in speculation and exclamation. Bernard held up his hands for silence. My daughter and Marshal Kane are engaged to be married. The wedding will take place as soon as arrangements can be made. I expect everyone here to treat them with the respect they deserve. Now go about your business. The crowd dispersed slowly, people drifting away in pairs and groups to dissect this unexpected development. Marshal felt like he was moving through a dream as Bernard shepherded them into the Turner Express office and sent a boy running to fetch the minister. Everything was happening so fast, but there was no turning back now. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church at the edge of town. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Marshal had bought a new suit for the occasion, his first in 5 years. The church was packed with curious onlookers, everyone eager to witness the hasty marriage and draw their own conclusions. Marshal barely heard the minister's words, too focused on Beatrice standing beside him. Her hand trembled slightly in his when he slid the gold band onto her finger, but her voice was steady when she spoke her vows. His own voice came out rougher than intended, full of emotions he was still trying to name. When the minister pronounced them married, Marshal kissed his new wife chastely, aware of all the watching eyes. But even that brief contact sent heat racing through his veins. Beatrice's lips were soft and she smelled like lavender, and he wanted nothing more than to deepen the kiss and ignore their audience entirely. The reception at Bernard's house was a subdued affair, more an acknowledgement of the marriage than a celebration. People came by to offer congratulations that ranged from genuine to skeptical, and Marshal endured it all with patient grace. Beatrice stayed close to his side, presenting a united front even as whispers swirled around them. When they finally escaped to Marshal's ranch in the early evening, the silence in the cabin felt deafening. They were married now, bound together legally and socially, but they were still strangers in so many ways. Marshal built up the fire while Beatrice examined the cabin that was now her home, taking in details she had been too exhausted to notice before. I brought some of my things from town, she said finally, gesturing to the trunk and bags Marshal had loaded onto the wagon. Though I will need to move the rest eventually. Take your time. This is your home now. Change whatever you want. Marshal stood awkwardly by the fireplace, unsure of the protocol for this situation. The bedroom is yours. I can sleep out here on the floor. Beatrice turned to face him. Marshal, we are married. Truly married, not just for show. If this is going to work, we need to act like it. I do not want you to feel pressured into anything. This marriage was my idea to protect you. You do not owe me anything because of that. I chose this too, she reminded him gently. When you made that offer, I could have refused. I said yes because I wanted to, not just because of gossip. She crossed the room to stand in front of him, close enough that he could feel her warmth. I saw something in you that day by the river, something good and strong and worth knowing better. I still see it. Marshal reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. I am not romantic, Beatrice. I am a simple man with simple ways. I cannot promise you poetry or grand gestures. I do not want poetry. I want honesty and kindness and someone who will treat me as an equal partner. Can you promise me that? Yes, he said without hesitation. That I can promise. She rose on her toes and kissed him, properly this time without the weight of watching eyes. Marshal responded immediately, his arms coming around her waist to pull her close. The kiss deepened and heat built between them, weeks of tension and unspoken attraction finally finding release. They made their way to the bedroom in a tangle of limbs and half-shed clothing, learning each other's bodies with the same careful attention they had been learning each other's minds. Marshal was gentle but passionate, and Beatrice responded with equal fervor, any remaining awkwardness burning away in the heat of their connection. Afterwards, they lay wrapped together in the darkness, Beatrice's head on Marshal's chest and his arm around her shoulders. The intimacy felt natural, as if they had been doing this for years rather than hours. Outside, an owl called and night insects sang their endless chorus. "What happens now?" Beatrice asked softly. "Now we build a life together. Work the ranch, grow your father's business, learn to love each other properly." Marshal pressed a kiss to her hair. "Though I think we are well on our way already." "I think so too." She traced lazy patterns on his chest. "This was not how I imagined getting married. But I cannot say I am disappointed with how things turned out." "Neither can I." They drifted to sleep tangled together, and when morning came they woke to face their first full day as husband and wife. There was work to be done, fences to mend and routes to survey, but they did it together now, building something neither had expected but both wanted with surprising intensity. The months that followed were an education for both of them. Beatrice learned the rhythms of ranch life, the endless cycle of feeding and watering and maintaining that kept the operation running. Marshal learned the intricacies of the freight business, helping Beatrice survey routes and assess road conditions. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, then fell into bed each night exhausted and content. Slowly, the gossip died down as people accepted that the marriage was genuine, not just a cover for scandal. Bernard became a frequent visitor to the ranch, pleased to see his daughter thriving and grateful to Marshal for making her happy. The Sullivan Ranch offered Marshal more responsibility, impressed by how his small spread was flourishing under his and Beatrice's combined management. By winter, Beatrice was pregnant. They discovered it on a cold December morning when she was sick for the third day running, and Marshal insisted on riding to Silver City for the doctor. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure, the weight of impending parenthood suddenly very real. "We are going to need a bigger house," Beatrice said, one hand on her still flat stomach. "This cabin is fine for two, but a baby needs space. Then we will build one." Marshal pulled her into his arms. "Whatever you and this child need, I will provide. I promise you that." True to his word, Marshal spent the winter and early spring building an addition onto the cabin, transforming it into a proper house with 3 bedrooms and a larger main room. Bernard sent workers from town to help, and the Sullivan Ranch contributed materials. By the time the wildflowers were blooming in May, The house was finished and ready for its newest occupant. Their son was born in June of 1879, exactly 1 year after Beatrice nearly drowned in the Gila River. They named him James, after Marshal's father, and he came into the world howling with impressive lung power. Marshal held his son for the first time with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the fragile weight and the fierce protectiveness that seized him. "He is perfect," he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "You are perfect. God, Beatrice, I love you so much. I love you too." She was exhausted but glowing, reaching up to touch his face. "Our family, we built this together." James grew from an infant to a toddler who kept them both running. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and he approached the world with fearless curiosity. Beatrice managed to balance motherhood with her work for Turner Express, often bringing James along on route surveys once he was old enough to sit a horse. Marshal expanded the ranch gradually, buying adjacent land when it became available and building his herd with careful breeding choices. By James's 3rd birthday, the Kane Ranch was one of the most prosperous in Grant County, known for quality cattle and honest dealing. The freight business flourished as well under Beatrice's management. When Bernard finally retired in 1882, he turned the company over to his daughter with complete confidence. She ran it from the ranch, combining her two worlds seamlessly and proving that a woman could indeed manage a major business operation. On quiet evenings, Marshal and Beatrice would sit on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. James would play at their feet, building elaborate structures from sticks and stones, while they talked about their days and made plans for the future. These moments were Marshal's favorite, simple and domestic, but full of a contentment he had never expected to find. "You ever regret it?" Beatrice asked one such evening. "Marrying me so suddenly, taking on all this responsibility?" Marshal pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "Not for 1 second. That day by the river when I saw you drowning, something in me knew you were going to change my life. I just did not realize how much, or how glad I would be for it. I was terrified when you pulled me out. Of dying, yes, but also of what came after. Everything happened so fast." She laced her fingers through his. "But I would not change any of it. You gave me a life I never could have imagined, Marshal Kane. We gave each other that life. Equal partners, remember, always." Their daughter arrived in 1883, a tiny thing with her father's gray eyes and a surprisingly loud cry. They named her Margaret, after Marshall's mother, and she immediately wrapped her parents around her tiny fingers. James was protective of his baby sister, following her everywhere once she learned to walk and appointing himself her guardian against all threats real and imagined. The years rolled past in a blur of work and family, challenges and triumphs. Droughts came and they weathered them together. Prices fluctuated and they adjusted accordingly. James grew into a tall young man who loved the ranch and wanted nothing more than to work it alongside his father. Margaret showed her mother's head for business and her father's quiet strength, a combination that promised great things. In 1895, on their 17th wedding anniversary, Marshal and Beatrice rode out to the place where he had pulled her from the river. The falls still thundered over the rocks, unchanged by time, but everything else in their lives had been transformed by that moment. 17 years, Beatrice marveled, staring at the churning water. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like we have always been together. Both are true, I think." Marshal wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I cannot imagine my life without you in it now. You and the children, the ranch, the business, all of it. You brought me everything worth having." "We brought each other everything worth having," she corrected, turning in his arms to face him. That is the truth of us, Marshal. We saved each other that day in more ways than one. He kissed her then, deep and long, with all the passion and love that had only grown stronger over the years. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling. "Come on," Beatrice said, taking his hand. "Let us go home. Our family is waiting." They rode back to the ranch as the sun set behind them. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from that chance encounter. The house rose in the distance, lights glowing in the windows, and they could see James and Margaret moving around in the barn finishing evening chores. That night, after dinner had been eaten and the children had gone to bed, Marshal and Beatrice sat on their porch in comfortable silence. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. Marshal reached over and took his wife's hand, feeling her fingers curl around his with familiar warmth. "Happy?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Completely," Beatrice confirmed. "You, more than I ever thought possible." And it was true. From that desperate moment in the river current to this peaceful evening on their porch, they had built a life together that exceeded either of their expectations. There had been hardships along the way, challenges that tested them both individually and as a couple, but they had faced everything together and emerged stronger for it. The Kane Ranch continued to prosper under their combined management. James eventually took over the daily operations, freeing Marshal to focus on breeding programs and long-term planning. Margaret joined her mother at Turner Express, showing an innovative approach to logistics that expanded the company into new territories. As the new century approached, Marshal and Beatrice found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. They took trips together, exploring the territories that had become so familiar through their work, but experiencing them now with the leisure to appreciate their beauty. They spoiled their grandchildren, 5 rowdy youngsters who kept the ranch lively and loud. On their 25th anniversary in 1903, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house could barely contain everyone, but they managed, spilling out onto the porch and into the yard. Bernard Turner, now well into his 70s but still spry, toasted his daughter and son-in-law with obvious pride. 25 years ago, I thought Marshal Kane was the most presumptuous young man I had ever met, proposing to my daughter after knowing her for 3 days. Bernard raised his glass. I have never been happier to be wrong about someone. He has been the best husband to Beatrice and the best father to James and Margaret that I could have hoped for. To Marshal and Beatrice, may they have many more years together. Hear, hear, the assembled family chorused, glasses clinking. Later, when the guests had departed and the house was quiet again, Marshal found Beatrice standing on the porch looking out at the moonlit landscape. He joined her, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture so familiar it was almost unconscious. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That day in the river, how close I came to dying, how different everything would be if you had not been riding fence line right then." She leaned into him. "All of this, our entire life together, hangs on that one moment of chance." "I do not think it was chance," Marshal said slowly. "I think it was fate. We were meant to find each other, Beatrice, meant to build this life together. You believe in fate now, the practical rancher who only deals in facts and figures. I believe in us. That is the only fact that matters." She turned in his arms and kissed him, tasting of champagne and joy. Marshal returned the kiss with the same passion he had brought to their first awkward encounter as newlyweds, the fire between them still burning bright after a quarter-century. The years continued their steady march. Marshal's hair turned from dark to silver, Beatrice's laugh lines deepened. But their love remained constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They danced at James's wedding and cried at Margaret's. They rocked grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren on that same porch where they had spent so many evenings. In 1918, as the world emerged from war and pandemic, Marshal and Beatrice celebrated their 40th anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them. They were both in their 60s now, slowed but not stopped by age. The ranch was in James's capable hands and the freight business had been sold to a larger company, allowing Margaret to retire comfortably. 40 years, Marshal said, studying his wife across the table. You are even more beautiful now than the day I pulled you from that river. You are a terrible liar, Beatrice laughed, but I love you for it anyway. I am not lying. You are beautiful, Beatrice Kane. You have always been beautiful to me. He reached across the table to take her hand. Every day I wake up grateful that I was riding fence line that June afternoon. Grateful that I saw you in the water. Grateful that you said yes when I made my ridiculous proposal. It was not ridiculous. It was brave. She squeezed his hand. We were both brave, taking that leap together. And look what we built from it. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, thinking about the long road they had traveled together. From strangers to spouses to parents to grandparents, they had navigated every stage with love and respect and partnership. The ranch had prospered, the business had flourished, the family had grown, all because two people had chosen to take a chance on each other. As the sun set that evening, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Marshal and Beatrice walked out to the place where their house stood. Lights glowed in the windows and smoke drifted from the chimney. James and his wife were inside preparing for a visit the next day, their children and grandchildren coming to celebrate the anniversary. This is what I am most proud of, Beatrice said softly. Not the ranch or the business, though those are good things. But this, the family we created, the home we built together, this is our real legacy. Ours, Marshal agreed. Everything we did together. Equal partners from the start. From the start, she echoed, smiling up at him. They stood there as darkness fell. Two people who had found each other in crisis and chosen to build a life together. The river that had nearly claimed Beatrice still flowed in the distance, but it held no fear for them now. It was simply part of their story, the place where everything began. Marshal lived to see his 85th birthday, still sharp-minded though his body had slowed considerably. Beatrice was at his side through everything, as she had always been. When he passed peacefully in his sleep in 1933, she mourned deeply, but without regret. They had been given more than 50 years together. Years filled with love and laughter and purpose. Beatrice followed him 2 years later, her heart finally giving out after a life lived fully and well. She was buried beside Marshal on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land they had built together. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them, sharing stories of the couple who had loved so deeply and lived so well. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down through generations. The cowboy who rode in to save a drowning woman and ended up marrying her 3 days later. The freight heiress who took a chance on a hasty proposal and found true love. Their descendants pointed to that moment in the river current as the beginning of everything, the foundation upon which the entire family was built. The Kane Ranch remained in the family, worked now by Marshal and Beatrice's great-great-grandchildren. The house they had built and expanded over the years still stood, full of life and laughter. And on quiet evenings when the work was done and the family gathered on the porch, someone would inevitably tell the story again, how she was drowning in the river current. How a cowboy rode in and grabbed her before she went over the falls. How from that moment of crisis came a love story that spanned more than half a century and created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. How two strangers became partners, then lovers, then the foundation of a family dynasty that spread across New Mexico and beyond. It was a story of courage and chance, of love and partnership, of two people who refused to let society's expectations limit what they could build together. It was a story that began in rushing water and desperate fear, but grew into something beautiful and enduring. It was, in the end, the story of Marshal and Beatrice Kane, who found each other against all odds and created a life together that neither could have imagined, but both were grateful for every single day. Their love had been tested by time and circumstance, by hardship and loss, by the endless challenges of building a life in the wild territories of the American West. But it had endured, growing stronger with each passing year, each shared triumph and weathered storm. They had been equal partners in every sense, supporting and challenging and loving each other through everything life threw at them. And it all began with a cowboy riding fence line on a June afternoon, who looked down and saw a woman drowning in the river current and rode in to save her before she went over the falls. From that single moment of courage and compassion came everything else, a love story for the ages and a legacy that would outlive them both by generations.